Wow, that's big. Aha, finally we get to a thrusting weapon. And in my opinion, this is actually the most appropriate. Hi there, I'm Matt Easton of Schola Gladiatoria, and I teach people how to sword fight. I also do things like TV and film stuff, and I work with the Royal Armouries on accurate replicas of real swords. And I'm an antique arms and armour dealer. And today I'm going to be looking at some of the weapons and equipment from Monster Hunter Wilds. That is a really big piece of steel. Moving steel, even when it's bright glowing red orange, is not that easy. So that is going to take a lot of work to move that amount of metal. Right, okay, so they do say forge thick, grind thin. So that is a thick piece of metal she's grinding on there. For real world physics, this would be a really, really heavy piece of metal to be working on a grinding wheel. But fundamentally, they have represented the correct order of things. So first of all, you forge your blade to an approximate shape, and then you grind away the surface material to get to the more precise shape. So she's kind of doing the right things. It's a very big grinding wheel. Grinding wheels like that did exist in the medieval period. They've, in fact, all the way up to the Roman period. And in fact, what a lot of people don't know is in the medieval period, many of these wheels, whether you're talking about Europe or Japan or China, many of these wheels were actually powered, usually water powered. So you might have heard of a water mill, but they could be powered in other ways. And we even see hand cranked ones. So sometimes someone's job is just to crank the wheel. Wow, that's big. Is this supposed to be made of bone? It is a massive, massive blade. So I think within the parameters of this particular game, we have to assume that the people have super strength, because there is no way on Earth that a human in our universe could fight with a sword of that size and subsequent weight. Right, okay, so looking at the weapon here being held, so it's a two-handed weapon, so they're standing in a convincing position with their feet wide spread to balance out the heavy weight of that sword. Now, I do understand these weapons are fantasy, and they're also for fighting monsters, and we have to accept that weapons like this Viking-era sword here were designed not for fighting monsters, but for fighting humans. And obviously for fighting humans, you want certain characteristics of a weapon. You want it to be very wieldable and quick, can be used in conjunction with things like shields, because humans are going to shoot arrows and throw spears at you. It has to be fairly quick and nimble, and it only needs to be powerful enough to kill a human. And let's face it, a small knife can do that. Whereas in a world with monsters, if we are going monster hunting, or indeed having to defend ourselves from monsters, you would end up with different weapons being designed. In reality, if you wanted to make a weapon this big, you'd have to make the blade very, very thin to make it light enough to be able to wield. So one thing that some of you out there might be asking is, are weapons or swords or knives, have they ever been made of things like bone in the real world? And the answer's yes, all the way back into the mists of time. So the earliest spears that we know about simply have hardened wooden points on them. But then we also find antler-tipped spears and arrowheads, and in fact in some of the South Sea islands, all the way up to the 20th century, where they didn't have metal, or they weren't refining or obtaining metal, they actually made knives and swords using teeth from sharks. So you can find shark's teeth swords. Fundamentally, yes, organic materials like bone, tooth, and antler absolutely were used for edged and pointed weapons throughout history. So it's interesting, the construction, because how I would interpret this, it does actually have a logic to it. It looks like there's a metal back to the blade which holds the bone blade. Now that actually makes quite a lot of sense. So maybe what we saw being forged before was the metal hilt and holder for the bone blade, which would make sense. And it looks like there might be rivets holding the back of that kind of casing onto the blade. Now, this construction method is actually historical, and we find it on Indian swords. So if you look at a certain Indian sword called a khanda, then we in fact find this construction where the blade is connected to the hilt via a sort of casing fitment that goes up the back and around the bottom of the blade. So it's actually quite convincing. So in terms of a sort of fighting style, this is very much a pick up the biggest object you can possibly swing and swing it as hard as you possibly can. And obviously the character here can jump very high as well, which is obviously very advantageous if you're fighting against giant creatures. Now, you could argue, is this a good tactic against a large monster, swinging a weapon like this? And personally, I would say no. Historically, when we look at people dealing with massive creatures, whether it's mammoths in prehistory or whether it's elephants in more recent history, what people generally do is they either use missile weapons, so very powerful bows, crossbows, harpoons, firearms, or if they're forced to use a hand weapon, then they tend to use large spears with thrusting. The reason for that is for a human-sized creature to swing a weapon hard enough to really injure, a big enough weapon to injure one of these massive creatures would be very difficult with a cutting mechanics. Whereas with thrusting, the weight and size, the mass and momentum of the creature actually works against it. The weapon will drive more deeply into the body of a massive creature. So something like a spear, lance, harpoon, generally speaking, is a quicker way of finishing off a very large creature than a swung cutting weapon, which wouldn't go very deep. I do really appreciate the sense of mass and momentum happening here, the inertia of that massive blade. So although it's almost unbelievable that you could have a sword of this kind of size, I do really appreciate that they have gone, okay, it is ludicrously heavy, but we're going to make the character move like they're swinging something ludicrously heavy. So this is a blocking move, which is really, really interesting idea because, of course, normally when we form guards and blocks with a sword, for example, but it could be a spear or a poleaxe or a quarterstaff, whatever, then we do, generally speaking, there's three main ways of dealing with an incoming attack. You either move out of the way of it, moving backwards or off to the side, but if you defend with the weapon, the two main ways are either interposing the weapon and putting it literally blocking in the way of the incoming thing. But against a massive creature like that with a huge amount of momentum, that might not be the best idea. So another option you have is deflection. In this particular case, this is a bit different because this is a massive monster hunting weapon. So actually you can hide behind it to an extent because it has such a lot of mass and size and width itself that you can literally hide behind that blade. So I actually really like how they've thought about this and adapted what you would do with this colossally massive, great chunk of a weapon. Well, first things first, I love the fact that the developers have actually thought about the issue of sharpening a blade. This is really, really rare in games, and I actually love that they considered that because the fact is that these swords, they get worn down, they get chipped, they get nicks in the edge, they can get broken. Even if you're just hitting flesh and bone, the edges do get blunted on bone. Could you sharpen a bone blade with a piece of rock? I guess, but looking at the animation, it would really help if she was actually sharpening the edge. Instead of it looks like she's rubbing it along the flat of the blade. So, on one hand, you give with one, you take away with another. I think it's great that they thought about this, but I personally advise them to do a better job of the animation to actually make it look like sharpening, because you can sharpen anything with a rock if you know what you're doing, but you have to do it in the right way. Aha! Finally, we get to a thrusting weapon. And, in my opinion, for fighting monsters of this kind, this is actually the most appropriate type of weapon. A lot of the time, all you need to do with a massive spear like this is just hold it and let the animal run onto it. Let the animal essentially injure itself. It also keeps them further away, from you. This particular design looks funky as heck. It's like a giant cone. So lances, in reality, for jousting, didn't usually look like this. There were some particular type of really quite fat jousting lances, and some of those were partially hollow, I think, designed to break on impact. Why would this lance be so thick? We can only say it's for strength because of the nature of the creatures that it's being used against. My interpretation is that this large cone is designed that way for strength, but is probably predominantly hollow and therefore not that heavy. You know, I do like one detail that the tip is made of steel or metal. You don't need anything behind that to be made of heavy material. So you could make everything behind that of quite light organic material and just have the tip made of steel. Aha! So it makes perfect sense. This is being used as a mounted weapon. In this case, this is perfect. Absolutely perfect. You don't want to be trying to swing a massive sword around from horseback. Did people occasionally do that in history? Very occasionally, but not normally. So lances are really the best, or certainly one of the best weapons to use mounted. Brilliant. I love the fact that this is a hat tip to history and logic, frankly. Physical, just basic science and logic, that they're using a lance and a shield when mounted. Great. Oh, I really liked that right at the end there, it looked like the person put their lance up and the creature fell down onto the end of it. And in my opinion, that would be the best way to do this. So it seems like a much more efficient way of letting the creature kill itself. Oh, right. Okay, so these are pretty cool looking swords. I really like the look of these. Now, I would say these look more like weapons for fighting humans rather than monsters. Why do I say that? Well, first of all, they're more reasonably sized. They're the normal size of a sword. But there's a couple of other reasons as well. Firstly, if you look at the blade, it is a forward-facing edge like a sickle. So this actually has a real-world parallel with a historical and surviving type of African weapon called a shotel. Okay, now a shotel actually has its primary edge on the inner face and curving forward exactly like this. It is said that the primary purpose of a shotel is to strike around the edge of an opponent's shield. It's really, really clever. So as you swing the weapon, the person puts their shield up in the way, but the curved blade comes over the top anyway and hits them in the face. It works really well against humans and particularly against defensive tactics, but it seems a bit like not necessary against monsters, and also you're going to be limited to the amount of penetration you can get on a large, massive creature. Right, okay, so we see the special attack there is to spin around like a great big Catherine wheel. This is obviously part of the game and the way that the fighting the creatures works in this game. I'm not going to critique that. It's fantasy, it's fun, it looks awesome actually. In the real world, spinning is usually not a way of attacking because turning your back on an opponent is usually not the best thing to do. However, there are some specific tactical exceptions to that, so I'm not going to be overly critical of that. The only thing I would say is these are very little weapons, and particularly with that curved blade, I'm not sure how effective these would be against a massive dragon-like armored scaly creature like this lizard. In that sense, although these are more realistic weapons, in a sense they're almost a less realistic choice of weapon to go against a monster like this. I'd rather have just a normal spear, to be honest. Aha! So, a Gunlance. I absolutely love this. And do you know what? Maybe not everyone watching this video realizes this is essentially a real thing, okay? If you think about it, a bayonet on a rifle is a Gunlance, okay? We also find certain combination weapons, we know them as. So, for example, you can find from the Tudor period onwards, a mace combined with a firearm. And also, going all the way forward to the 19th century, you sometimes find officers' swords like this, fitted with a pistol on the side. So combination weapons are a real thing. Most of them are kind of gimmicky, but the musket and bayonet, an absolute world beater. All right, okay. I've got a problem with this bow. So when we were looking at the giant swords, I kind of go, okay, well, these people are super strong. That's why they can use these giant, ludicrous, gigantic swords. But the bow, the problem is we're dealing with other physics. And the problem here is you've got limbs. So the limbs of the bow are the bits above and below the grip. Now, these limbs have to be able to flex, and they have to be able to recover back to their resting position. That is what shoots an arrow. If I was going to excuse this from a world-building fantasy point of view, I guess we can say that those are some sort of laminated mechanical limbs that are hugely powerful, require a huge amount of power to draw, and yes, they are inefficient, but they still have a huge amount of power going into them, a bit like a Roman ballista, maybe, and therefore, it's still an effective bow. Let's have a look. Yeah, okay, so the arrow being shot is a spear. And I've got to say, okay, kind of kudos here. This is essentially at this point akin to a Roman ballista. So Roman ballistas shoot massive bolts or arrows, which are about the size of a spear. They shoot quite a long way, but they hit with a huge amount of energy. So yeah, okay, this is basically a hand-drawn ballista. Fine, I can buy into that. It looks cool. Aha! So it's a kind of glaive. So it's got a chopping blade at one end, and we do actually find some polearm blades that look a bit like that historically. And at the other end, it has what looks like a melon with a spike coming out to the end. So I imagine these are all made of body parts. This is a blunt-ended cutting blade. So it's a bit like a sword. So it's going to be used somewhat like a sword, except that it's double-ended. So the other end is like a mace, one end's like a sword, and you've got a pointy end. This doesn't seem like a very sensible weapon for fighting large creatures to me. It's fun, don't get me wrong, it looks fun, I like the design, but it wouldn't make an awful lot of sense fighting large creatures. Why not have a good thrusting point? You could make a weapon that was longer, lighter, more nimble, with a deeper penetrating thrust. Let's see how it's used. Okay, spinny. So it's being used rather like a Chinese wushu staff. So one problem with using cutting polearms, which have a round shaft, is what we call edge alignment. So it's very important with an edged weapon to hit with the edge. Surprise, surprise, the sharp edge is the bit which cuts. If you hit things with the flat, or even at, and I'm being careful because this is actually a sharp sword, if you hit at a slight angle, you're not going to cut, or at least you're not going to cut very much. So edge alignment is rather difficult, and I would say for this particular weapon, because it has defined edges to use, it should really have an octagonal or hexagonal or even rectagonal shaft, so you can feel the edge alignment, what's called indexing. Index the edge in your hand without having to look at the weapon. So I think this weapon would be a nightmare to use, really difficult to get that edge aligned. It doesn't have a really good thrusting point at either end. It's got a short one at the back end, but that mace end that looks like a melon is not really going to do much at all.
You did it!
So this looks like an absolutely fun game to play. I'm going to have to give it a try and learn a bit more about these weapons. In terms of the weapons, I found the swords somewhat ridiculous from a natural real sword perspective, but I understand this is a game about slaying monsters, and it has to look a certain way on screen, so it's fine. I did particularly love actually the use of the lance, and of all of the things we looked at today, the use of the lance from a mounted monster, essentially from riding a creature of your own, would definitely, I think, be the most convincing way that we've seen today for taking out some of these creatures, because you've got more momentum, you've got the momentum of the creature you're sitting on, you've got a piercing weapon which can go very deep into the target, you don't have to swing something around, you get the creature to run fast and then you skewer the thing, so very convincing. The only thing I would wish that we had seen a little bit more of was a little bit of using weapons in more of an ambush scenario, whereby you actually get to the right position to tempt the creature to charge at you, and then you plant the weapon and let them skewer themselves on it, because that would clearly, if you were on foot, be the best way of dealing with creatures of this size.
For even more expert reacts, make sure to check out Matt Easton reacting to Kingdom Come Deliverance 2. Or for more Monster Hunter, why not watch our Wilds review?